King Charles III and Queen Camilla visit France. Last week, King Charles III paid a state visit to France, where his speech before the National Assembly and Senate received a standing ovation. Walter Ellis is a journalist and commentator born in Northern Ireland and based in France. He is the author of The Beginning of the End, The Downside of a Happy Irish Childhood. Welcome to Royal Pancakes. Please don't forget to subscribe and click the notifications bell, so you don't miss any updates about the British royal family. The thoughts of Henry VIII, King of England from 1509 to 1547, on today's electric cars and gas boilers can only be imagined. What is certain is that he took a strong position on royal prerogatives. When Henry's first Prime Minister, Cardinal Wolsey, died of natural causes on his way to York to stand trial for treason, he was considered a lucky man. His successor, Thomas Cromwell, was subsequently beheaded without trial after failing to satisfactorily comply with his royal master's wishes. 500 years later, the current British monarch and the outgoing Prime Minister are at odds again, although this time the dispute is over the pace of change towards net zero, and is unlikely to prove fatal. Nevertheless, it caused excitement in the Palace of Westminster over a possible collision. Last week, King Charles III made a state visit to France, where his speech to the National Assembly and the Senate received a standing ovation. The audience cheered, the bands played and the French media, admittedly submissive, couldn't get enough. But that's when the net zero gap emerged. The king has long been a passionate environmental activist. Once ridiculed for speaking to the trees on his various estates, he is now seen as an informed and prophetic advocate of the need to contain and, if possible, reverse the worst effects of climate change. And in his speeches in France, Charles warned that Europe must focus relentlessly on the challenges posed by the existential nature of climate change, which could lead to the catastrophic destruction of nature. Seeking something positive to soften the edges of his comments, the king added that he was encouraged by the measures taken by the UK and French governments to tackle the crisis. He didn't think about exactly what measures he had in mind. He is too wise to delve into the details of domestic politics, something the convention forbids, at least publicly. But it is safe to say that in the UK context he was referring to the Tory government's repeated commitment to achieve net zero by 2050, starting with a ban on the sale of new diesel or gas cars and gas boilers by 2030. Unfortunately for His Majesty, his Prime Minister had other ideas. At a hastily called press conference in London, the day before the King rose to speak in Paris, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced that 2030 was not the new date for fossil fuel cars and boilers would now be 2035, just like in the EU, leading to speculation within the green community that the 2050 target is also now at the forefront and likely to be rejected or scrapped. According to Sunak, there was no need to rush and, in fact, 3 days later it was announced that his government had approved the development of a huge new oil field in British waters to the west of Shetland. While media coverage of Charles in Paris reflected the perception of him as an eco-warrior, the headlines that greeted Rishi Sunak's removal from office in 2030 were quite different. At this point, the Prime Minister threw caution to the wind. All that remained was a long-awaited decree from Downing Street announcing the cancellation of the second phase of HS2, the planned high-speed rail link between London and Manchester, a decision which would be warmly welcomed by the British roads lobby and some others. So while media coverage of Charles in Paris reflected the perception of him as an eco-warrior, the headlines that greeted Sunak's removal from office in 2030 were quite different.